And we're live. Hello and good evening. Welcome to our virtual presentation of Guilty Admissions and Who Gets In and Why. We are here today with authors Nicole LaPorte and Jeff Selingo. This event includes an audience Q&A, and if you would like to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question feature at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like for our speakers to answer, and they'll make their way to the very top of the list. Also, please consider supporting our bookstore tonight by purchasing a copy of any of the featured books. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and it will take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Vroman's is the oldest independent bookstore in Southern California. We are 126 years old, and it's support from patrons like yourselves that keep us running. So we appreciate any kind of support that you can give us tonight. And with that said, let me briefly introduce our guests, and then we can get the event started. Nicole LaPorte is an LA-based senior writer for Fast Company. She previously was a columnist for the New York Times and a staff writer for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and Variety. She's also the author of The Men Who Would Be King, Movies, Moguls, and a Company Called DreamWorks. Joining her tonight is award-winning journalist Jeff Selingo, who has reported on higher education for more than 2 decades. His writing has appeared in The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and many more. He is also the best-selling author of There Is Life After College and College Unbound. So with that said, I'm going to turn off my camera. Enjoy the talk, everyone.
Great.
Thanks.
Welcome, everybody. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. tonight, and which plays a role in the Varsity Blues scandal at Georgetown University, which we'll be talking about at some point with Nicole. So just to tell you a little bit about the night, we'll be focusing on both books, but we're really going to lean in a little bit to Nicole's here because it just came out right yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday. Pub day.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, Nicole, I want to talk to you a little bit about the journey of this book, right? Because you started to plan this book within the days of the Varsity Blues scandal breaking, right? And obviously, this was like a fascinating story, right? In the 20 plus years I've covered higher education, I don't ever remember a higher education story kind of leading the news, being on, Extra, being on the, at the supermarket, being on Us Weekly and all these other things, right? There were so many juicy angles to this story, but you decided to focus on the book on LA as the epicenter of the scandal. What about LA, the LA angle of this story made it so interesting for the book?
Well, first of all, when I first started, it literally was maybe a week after the scandal broke. So yes, I shamelessly pursued a book deal. But the story is just so sprawling. I mean, there's so many parents involved. There are over 40. There are coaches. There's so many stories within the story. There's a story of Rick Singer himself. And I literally kind of put note cards down on the floor, that very week. And I was just like, I don't know how, I can't tackle all of it. And I also knew the book needed to be turned around fairly quickly. So I knew I had to pare it down and make it manageable and write a story that I could tell. And I did also want to bring my unique vision to it because I knew, there were other projects in the work. I knew a lot of people were jumping on this story. And I didn't at first know that LA was the way I was going to go in, but it came up pretty quickly because I started calling around to talk to parents at high schools in Los Angeles. And I was trying to get information about the parents involved in the scandal. And so I was looking for anyone who knew these parents, who were they, what were their reputations, what kind of color could I get about them? And so I kept having these phone calls with parents at private schools, and I just kept hearing the same things. And at that point, I wasn't getting that much on the actual parents, but I just was talking to these parents of high school kids, and there was real despair and real fear and this sense of, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. I'm paying all this money for this wonderful school. My kid is, captain of the soccer team. She or he has a 4.0, and yet we're being told, or we're getting the sense that my child is not actually going to be able to go to the school he or she wants to. So that was one thing, just this frustration. It was very surprising because I was like, well, wait, you are going to that school. The kid is doing everything right. What happened? Like, why is college admissions? How has it turned into this? And then the other thing that was just the culture of fundraising at these schools and how, these kids are admitted to some of these schools and a week later they're being sent a letter, requesting a quote unquote donation. And that factored into the scandal because Rick Singer used donations as kind of the veil for what were ultimately bribes. And so again, I'm talking to parents who are sort of complaining to me about this culture of fundraising and writing checks endlessly, and many of them don't even know why they're doing it. They're just like, I will do anything to help my kids. So if this gets me any kind of influence, I'm going to do it, but I don't believe in it, and that kind of thing. So I thought, okay, there's this interesting subculture that people don't know about that might be interesting to write about and for people to read about. And two, I'm hearing the context of the scandal. So if you can understand this environment and you can understand what these, for the most part, very privileged parents are feeling and the terror they're feeling, as well as this culture of, as I call it, pay to play, you get that much closer to understanding the scandal and sort of how we got here. So that was
right. And I think that idea of the anxiety of college admissions, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, because that's something that I saw in my book in terms of, we used to, especially today's parents who probably went to college in the 80s, early 90s, when it was easier to get into many of these selective schools than it is today. We think that this is a much scarcer commodity now, not even a commodity, it's just a scarcer thing. And as a result, we kind of pull out all the stops to get our kids into school. And these parents seem to went a little bit above that in this case. But I want to ask you about Rick Singer, because we've heard so much about him through this scandal. And one of the things that interests me is you point out when, he was in Sacramento and then he got into LA, and you say, you point out that it was the Sacramento effect, where Singer was previously, only times 10. And one thing that interests me about Singer is, in LA, it seems to me, connections matter, right? You get into these social circles and things like that. How did he end up infiltrating those circles so that he was so well known and so deep in all of these private high schools? Like, it's just an interesting character to kind of come from, another place and get in to those social circles. Could you talk a little bit about how he was able to get into those circles?
Yeah, I mean, and just to contrast with Sacramento, because Rick started his business in the early 90s in Sacramento, and back then it was pure word of mouth, and Sacramento's just a different vibe, it's a different place, it's a different culture. And then also early on it was legitimate, there wasn't cheating going on, but he would work with a kid and get them in, and then the parent, it was like the old-fashioned word of mouth, and the parent talks to the other parent, and the next, it just grew. So it was very grassrootsy, it was very organic. And then when you cut to LA later, and Southern California too, it's not just Los Angeles, which is like 2009, he starts, he comes in at a much higher level. One of the parents involved in the scandal was Douglas Hodge, who was the CEO of PIMCO, which is a financial institution. And through Doug, Rick was giving his presentations at places like PIMCO. He would give them at Oppenheimer. So he got into this wealth management circle. So if you're, not just a wealthy person, like if you have a wealth manager, you're probably very, very wealthy. And you're being invited to Oppenheimer or PIMCO to, watch, hear this guy talk to you about college admission. So it just sets a totally different tone. I mean, you're not questioning his legitimacy. You're totally buying it. If anything, he's coming with, the seal of approval. So that was the difference. It was like Sacramento was really, he's giving presentations in Sacramento at like the rec center and the swim club, and in LA, it's like Hotel Bel Air and these places. So it was just a completely different entree. And once there were enough of those connections in those circles, then it was word of mouth.
It opens the doors everywhere else. Right. Yeah, interesting. So, it was interesting you were talking about parents, but when the scandal first broke, the thing that I noticed, it was often the mothers that were heavily involved in this. And you mentioned in your book kind of the mothers' insecurities. And it's interesting, Nicole, that I'm a parent as well. And my wife and I have talked a lot about this not only during the scandal, but the reporting for my own book, because one of the things I've always noticed when I'm out, as I was reporting a book on colleges and universities, and admissions, your ear tends to perk up when you overhear people near you talking about admissions. And so, I'd be flying on planes, I'd be in coffee shops. And it was interesting to me how it was always the mothers discussing these issues and really worried about their kids. What can you explain a little bit about how Singer kind of played to the mother's insecurities and their instincts to help their children?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's not even specific to this scandal, but I have a chapter in the book on preschools. And I remember talking to the head of one preschool here, and she said, and this is one of these schools where the parents or some parents show up and sort of say, okay, so this preschool leads to this school and it's all going to end up at Harvard, right? And she told me,
Of course.
which of course is just how it works. But she told me it was always the dads who asked that, or the dads put the emphasis on the school and the name brand, which also shows up in the scandal, right? The dads are more like, just get this done and get the kid into USC or get the kid into Harvard or whatever it is. But the moms, it's very different, and the narrative kind of replays itself if you look at some of these parents involved in the scandal. One of them is Felicity Huffman, but also Jane Buckingham, and both of those two, just to look at them, they talked a lot about mother guilt and this term mommy guilt that we all know, and they felt that they had been bad mothers. I mean, Felicity Huffman had this whole business, this whole website about being a bad mom and how she had always felt like, she'd always been working and she didn't do enough drop-offs and pickups and she hadn't been there for her kids. And similar, Jane Buckingham had the same story. And I think that somehow there's calculus going on in their minds that's like, well, I haven't been there for you as much as I would have liked up until now, but I'm going to make it up to you with college. Like, I'm going to get this done. Like, I'm going to compensate. And so, and woven into that is the sense that, they're doing it for their kid. All they want is the best for their kid. And the kid's dying to go to this school. I'm going to make it happen. But yeah, it's interesting. It's very much more tied into the sense of a mother who's failed and how this is an opportunity to make that right. And then Singer was very cognizant of it. And, with Jane, for example, who's going through a divorce, was basically a single mom when all this was going on. I mean, he would say to her, Jane, you're an amazing mom. You do so much. And so he knew exactly who he was playing and he knew exactly what he was working with.
Yeah. By the way, Pete, folks are asking questions. Please keep those coming. Yeah. We're definitely going to get to them, closer to the end of the program, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So please keep asking them in the Q&A. Nicole, I want to dig deeper into the kind of the mechanics of the scandal, because it was huge in so many ways. But there were two aspects to the side door, as Rick Singer called them. One was athletics, and one was the testing piece of it. I want to ask you about the athletics piece of it, because your book dives into the coaches who enabled this side door scheme at some schools, including Georgetown, right? And these are coaches of kind of lower profile sports. They tend to be anonymous, even at Division I schools. You describe somebody like Gordy Ernst, the tennis coach at Georgetown, as epitomizing the kind of the weary, put upon college coach that is largely hidden from the public eye. Yet at the same time, he was described as a bit sloppier, as you put it, perfect prey for Singer. So they were critical. I mean, the coaches were critical to that part of Singer's scheme. So how exactly did he find them? It's not like you show up on a college campus, you're Rick Singer, you show up on a college campus, you start saying, well, who are the coaches that I could kind of get? Right. So how did he find these coaches?
Well, the thing is, Rick Singer had been around, right? So he started his first independent college counseling business in the early 90s. And from then on, he was at these colleges. And one thing I learned, and some of this I actually learned after the book was turned in, so some of this may be not in the book, but coaches knew him. Jovan Vavic, the water polo coach at USC, I mean, his lawyer, and he's fighting the charges, but his lawyer said, Jovan had known Rick forever. Like, before it turned into the scandal and illegal doings, Rick was at the colleges talking to the coaches about how to get kids in as recruits, whether it was a walk-on or a scholarship or whatever, legitimately. So he knew this. And another conversation I had post-book was with someone who was familiar with the athletic department at UCLA. And I remember this guy saying to me, like, everybody knew Rick. Rick was always there. I mean, Rick was this very maniacal, aggressive, relentless person who is in people's faces. And so I think he had kind of, through his legitimate work, he got to know the lay of the land, he got to know the personalities, and then he kind of knew where to press and where, who was going to give.
That's interesting. That's interesting, but there were still so many people involved. I mean, by the way, this is a great book. It's
Thank
really
you.
a page turner in so many
Thank
ways. And one thing I just kept wondering, I kept marking all the names, and I'm just like, wow, you start to realize just how wide this scandal was in terms of all the people, right? So it seems like there's a lot of players in this scheme located all over the country, and it went on for a pretty long time. So how did it go on for so long with so many people partaking in it? And it doesn't, obviously it eventually falls apart, but how did it not fall apart sooner? Did you ever wonder that as you were kind of kept pulling the string for the reporting?
Yeah,
of the
no,
story?
definitely. And especially in these tight-knit communities where everybody talks and everyone's at the
Right.
soccer game and whatever. But someone said something to me that I think sort of, does as best we can to answer the question, which is it was a hub and spoke conspiracy. So he's at the center, Rick Singer is the hub, and there are many, many, many spokes, as you say, but they're not all connected.
Okay.
So, coach I talked to, and also you have to understand when Rick talks to most of these people, it's all in this veiled language, they're never saying it's a bribe. They're never, so it's all, so like when he spoke with John Vandemore at Stanford, it was very much, I don't think the word bribe was ever used.
Okay.
So there's kind of this wink, wink thing going on. And, the Stanford coach had no knowledge of any other coaches. Some of the coaches did. If you just look at the facts, you can see. But I think, and then Rick's operation itself was very lean. I mean, there was an accountant, there was someone who did paperwork, but he was really this lone guy running. And this wasn't this huge organization he was running. So I think that, and yeah, and then the parents, I think they just knew what was on the line. That if this
Now
got
there
out,
were a group that were a little suspicious. The high school counselors. There's one of my favorite scenes in the book, right, where it is Felicity, right? It's Felicity Huffman's daughter, right? When they go to Patron, the daughter's high school, Marymount.
Yeah, Lori Laughlin.
Yeah, Lori
Massimo
Laughlin.
and,
Yeah,
the
Massimo's.
Massimo scene.
Right, the Massimo scene, right? So he goes to school, right, to confront essentially Petroni. Is it Patron or Petroni?
I think Patron, yeah.
Patron, who is the high school counselor, who was very skeptical and suspicious of Singer and the students who used him, because it was actually pretty well seems to be a little bit widespread in that school, and the students outrightly ignored the school when it came to college counseling. You described this class that they have, and the students are just not really paying attention to the counselors and things like that. So what about the culture, not only at Marymount but at other high schools, really stopped counselors from pursuing this? I get the sense it's all because of the money and the power of these parents, or is it that most of these parents were using independent counselors and the school counselors just don't have time to police them all? What was it more about the money or the power? Was it more about the independent counselors? What was happening that clearly there was some suspicion on these high school counselors' part, but that's about as far as it went.
Yeah, I think it's both those things. I mean, I
Okay.
think, and I'm sure know, as much, not more than I do about this, but there's kind of this strange dance between, independent college counselors who are hired outside the school and the counselors in the school, and no one really wants to acknowledge each other. And the schools, I mean, based on the directors or the heads of schools I talked to, they stop short of saying you can't hire these people because, parents are their clients. Parents are paying a lot of money. I mean, you can't really tell them not to, but they will discourage them or remind them of how great their own counselors are and how those counselors really do know the kids and are with them, been with them for years and that kind of thing. But I do think there's a power play, and it's certainly not just at Marymount where, again, like the parents are the clients. And Massimo wasn't just paying tuition. He was a big donor. So he's giving, hundreds of, or I can't remember the number, but
Right.
a lot of money to Marymount. And, if he comes in and, I think it's hard for the counselor to say you're lying. And so that scene's actually really interesting because Patron played it perfectly from a legal sense. He even took notes on it all, which is why there are these great details. But is very careful in what he says. So he knows the daughters are not, the older daughter and the Olivia are not rowers, but he can't say you're lying, I don't believe you. So he simply says, I will relay what you're telling me to USC. So I'm just going to be the conduit here.
Right.
And I do think it's a power play. And I talked, I sort of had conversations with administrators and former administrators. And yeah, it's a little bit, the parents, a lot of parents treat this like a concierge service. And I think the schools play into it to some degree.
Yeah, it's a fascinating scene, and the details are incredible. So I was wondering how you got. So the notes,
Oh, that's
obviously,
all public.
Yeah.
I had nothing to do with it. It was totally
Yeah.
public.
So I want to ask about USC in particular, because USC played a big role there. And, I've been amazed at the lengths that people will go into get into USC, because I actually feature USC in my book as well, in a little section around how schools like it were really regional schools. And actually USC saw a huge drop off in applications, as I describe in my book, after the 92 LA riots. But it was clear that USC was also this fundraising machine, and they had all of these people on their radar. So it makes me wonder, couldn't some of these parents just write a huge check to USC to get in?
Yeah, you would think so. And in fact, Massimo was approached and Massimo, who didn't actually graduate from USC, but loved the school.
He even had a flag, right? He had a USC flag,
right?
flying,
Like, loved the school, and was part of a fraternity when he took some classes there, but he wasn't actually enrolled. But he was approached by development officers, and this is also in the court documents. They're approaching him saying, "Hey, can we set up a tour? We know your daughter's about to apply for college. We'd love to help you." And he dismisses them. He's sort of like, I've got this going on with Singer. I think that speaks to just the power of Singer and the influence of Singer to convince these people, these very powerful, very wealthy people, that no, it wasn't, that nothing was enough,
Right.
that your money doesn't matter. You don't have enough, that it's going to cost you 50 million to, donate a library wing or whatever to USC, whereas I'll charge you 500 grand. So
Okay.
there was a lot of manipulation, just psychologically.
It's interesting, Nicole, because that's the thing that I saw in my book in reporting Who Gets in Why around this idea of scarcity in particular, right? So I want to, before we start to transition into
let's transition.
a little bit of my book and then the audience questions, I really do want to end on this idea of prestige and scarcity, because that's what this whole scandal is predicated on, the idea that it wasn't about just getting into any school. It was about getting into a certain set of schools. And it really gets into this idea that it matters where you go to college, even if you come from money and fame. So does it? I mean, did you feel like that everybody thought that even though they had all the privilege in the world to give their kids whatever they wanted, including, by the way, no matter where they went to college, they could open up doors for them for jobs and everything else, I'm assuming. But yet where they went to school really mattered to them. So does it? Does that name on the back sticker of the car really matter as much as we think it does?
I mean, I think a lot in our culture tells us that it does. And whether it's the bumper sticker, whether it's the sweatshirt. I mean, the other thing that came up is, all these schools, and probably public schools too, but they have like college sweatshirt day. So for seniors. And I remember someone telling me their daughter was embarrassed, she didn't want to wear the sweatshirt. So I think there's a lot in our culture that speaks to it, but I think there's a shift happening. And it also comes down to, white shoe law firms or, investment banks. We all know what schools they're going to tap into first. But I think that said, I think there's a lot changing. I think as people become more educated about all these different types of schools out there are a lot more books being written, like Frank Bruni's book, like your book. And I think it's interesting just in the last year with all the social unrest, I think even that's affecting things. I think there's this desire in the culture to shake things up and not just, adhere to, this kind of hierarchy that that we've subscribed to. And it was interesting. I write for Fast Company, and I did a story recently on LeBron James's company Spring Hill, and I interviewed his CEO, Maverick Carter, who's a very accomplished CEO, been doing this a long time, and the company does very well. And I remember him saying, I don't want to have a meeting with my executives or my employees and feel like everyone went to the same 4 schools on the East Coast, because I will never get an original idea out of that meeting. So I think shifts like that, I think it has to happen at the business level, and sort of these other industries that then filter down to parents. But I do think there's a shift.
Yeah,
What do
and
you
it
think,
also
though?
has to. Yeah, it also has to happen. I think with you get real data on it. It's interesting that when I was doing the last book, my There Was Life After College, I spent a lot of time with the hiring people at Credit Suisse, and one of the things that they found was that they kept losing these really high-end graduates that they were getting. Maybe after a year or two, they would go on and they would go work for a hedge fund or do something completely different. And so they brought in a person from McKinsey around people analytics. They hired their first like chief people analytics officer, which a lot of big companies are now doing, to really get into the data of how they hire and who really survives and thrives at these firms. And as I described in the last book, there were like 30 elements of the people at Credit Suisse who really survived and thrived. And one of the things they noticed was that it didn't actually matter where you went to school as much as they thought. GPA didn't matter as much as they thought. They thought, well, we only could hire people in like quantitative majors. That didn't matter as much, right? Leadership didn't matter as much as they thought, especially if it was elected, right? If it was earned leadership, that mattered a lot. Music majors matter a lot. So what Credit Suisse did after this, and there's a lot of stuff that they wouldn't tell me and how they did that analysis, but one of the things they did is they restructured their college recruiting calendar and where they recruited. So somebody in the comments mentioned, right, Wall Street, certain big law firms only recruit in certain places. And that was Credit Suisse. They only recruited in certain places. Now, what was interesting is they broadened the number of places where they went recruiting, but who did the recruiting? The people who graduated from all the, selective schools. So what they found then is that somebody who went to Harvard would go into, another school, unnamed, and they would say, well, they wouldn't trust the applicants. So they would actually judge them harsher and harder. And those applicants then actually would never get over the bar to get in. So there was the kind of the analytics piece of it, which said broaden it. But then there was the people piece of it when they actually went to do the interviews that couldn't get in. So I get why, parents think about this, right? But I think what you have to remember also is that every year you have millions of college graduates, 60,000 of them maybe graduate from the most selective schools in this country. So, we have more than 60,000 good jobs out there. Yes. Is it much harder to get into the Wall Street firms and things like that? No doubt about it. And if that's your definition of success, then you probably should go to these highly selective schools. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I trace back in my book is kind of the history of how we got to where we are with these selective schools, right? I mentioned in the book, I don't have it, I used to have it right in front of me. I interned at U.S. News and World Report in college. I worked on the college rankings. Right. And when the editor of the college rankings passed away about a decade ago, his widow gave me all the rankings going back to the late 80s when they really started on an annual basis. And I picked up, as I mentioned in the intro of my book, I picked up the 1990 or 91 edition, right around the time I would have been looking for colleges. And when you look at the acceptance rate of colleges, which is right around the time probably a lot of the parents on here went or had just graduated, it is like you think there's typos. Because, for example, Penn, the University of Pennsylvania in 1990 accepted 42% of students, almost half, right? Wash U, 62%, right? And now both of those are under 10, under 15, under 10 in most cases. And why is that? Because most of these places nationalized in a way. I described this in the book. This is what USC did. This is what Northeastern did, right? They nationalized their recruiting in a way that they hadn't before and internationalized it. The other thing is that the concept of distance really changed. So somebody on the East Coast going to USC, even as late as the 1980s, it seemed pretty far away. You didn't have devices like this where students could, text you, your kids could text you all the time. I remember when my sister went to college in the 80s, she had to go down the hall, call us on a payphone after 10 o'clock at night, right? When the rates went down, right? So this concept of distance then started to change, and so you started to get the best students from Boston and Buffalo and Raleigh and Miami now starting to apply to the same set of 10 schools. Then you add on top of that the Common App and online applications. And now suddenly with a press of a button, except for Georgetown because they're not part of the Common App, you could essentially apply to 10 or 12 schools. It was so much easier than I know when I applied and I had to type out, multiple applications. So you didn't want to apply to more than 3 or 4. So all of these things, somebody said phone rates went down to 11. Yes. So it was all of these things that came together. Yeah.
No, I wanted to, because there's one piece, and maybe you're getting into, but this is what I think is so fascinating, and I want to hear you describe it, because I wasn't that aware of it until I did this book. But the other thing that changed, right, is that what colleges wanted out of kids. And I remember when I applied also like early 90s, it was all about being well-rounded. Like if you do a sport and you're a pretty decent student, you do some volunteer, like you're good to go pretty much. And now it's, the term is pointy.
Yep.
And people, and this is getting back to what I was talking about, the parents who are so frustrated and confused. It's like, does my child have to be perfectly branded at age 15? I mean, that's such an insane and unfair thought. But the college, like something happened on the college side of this, right? Where suddenly they were looking at the class as, a sort of well-rounded class as opposed to the student. But
yeah, right. So they were looking at the context of the class. And one thing I always remind applicants is that admissions is nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the priorities of the college. And so the college in a given year might want more kids from South Dakota. They might want more kids who excel in maybe they're trying to build up their engineering program. So they want more kids who excel in STEM fields. They might even have more narrow ideas, right? Obviously you focus a lot on athletics in the book. The same thing I saw so often in the year I was embedded in admissions at the 3 institutions I was at, where athletics, even at Emory, right, which is a highly selective urban university in Atlanta, and it's not Division I, but they still have a team. They still have all these teams to fill, and I remember sitting in one instance that I describe in the book where the admissions officer is not really that excited about the applicant, but the coach really wants to fill that seat. So it's all of these priorities that are coming together, and you as the applicant, unless you fill that particular priority they need, to be honest with you, there's 20 others of just like you. And that's why you kind of, the branding, as you mentioned, right? You need that kind of different hook. But the other thing about that different hook is it actually has to match what they want. And that's the problem. So you might think, I have the perfect hook. Why am I not getting in? And it may just be that they don't want more of whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. But what I liked about your book is that I feel like it's overall a positive book, and it gives parents hope. And you had this amazing access. I mean, believe me, no college admissions officers were talking to me for my book. And yet you embedded yourself and were there for a year, and they're like showing you files and letting you sit on meetings. It's amazing. So you really got to see their perspective. And, what I took away from your book is like, you should not despair. And so can you just talk about, because I'm sure there are many parents here tonight who like, why should you not, be tearing your hair out, and why should you not lose hope in this process?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I started reporting this book before Varsity Blues, so it would have been very interesting if this happened. Varsity Blues broke the year I was inside these offices, and it was at the end of the cycle, and so it would have been actually very interesting if it was the following year and I approached these, whether they would have done it. Here's why I give hope: is first of all, when we talk about selective colleges accept basically under half of the students who apply. And there's only about 200 of them in the country, but there are 200 of them. They're not 10, they're not 5, they're not 15. And so really what I'm encouraging parents to do is there's much less of a difference between number 20 and number 40 in some rankings than we tend to give it credit for. And so one of the things that really frustrated me in reporting the book is how we tend to think of there's only 10 or 12 or 15 schools. And if you just widen that lens a little bit more, it is very possible to get into these institutions, right? They don't have a 8% acceptance rate. They might have a 25% acceptance rate, which is still really good when you compare them to all these institutions out there. And the other thing is that and I know this after covering colleges for more than 20 years and also looking at the employer side, is a lot of it matters what you do when you're there, right? So you could get into Harvard and do absolutely nothing. And yes, the Harvard degree will maybe open doors for you, but is not necessarily going to push you through everything in life. It's what you do in college that matters, I think, a lot more in some cases than where you go.
I think what I also liked about your book, because my book really focuses on a certain class of people, and you followed different students, and some of them didn't, went to schools with, not a lot of resources. The guidance counselor maybe wasn't totally up to speed on where this kid would best be fit, or, these are the opposite of the kids that I was writing about. And then you had a term in your book for the ones who were like, they were on it. They were the movers. They were the ones who.
They were the drivers as opposed to the passengers.
Yep. Right. And so these were the kids from resources who get on this boat early. And by junior year, they're done applying. Whereas these other kids they're almost, just from a time frame standpoint, left behind a bit, because it's not even dawning on them to apply to college, or they don't have their ducks in a row, at the beginning of senior year. But you really saw that divide when you talk about early decision.
Yes.
And I love what you said about, because you said, and so that, as well as the fact that early decision has become perhaps the biggest, hair pulling out factor in all this. And you say,
well, and Nicole, I think that plays into a really good question that has come up, right? So actually, why don't we move to that? Because somebody asked a question for both of us. Somebody we both recognize, and it's, if you can wave a magic wand and change one thing about admissions to make it more fair, what would that one thing be? So I'm going to answer first because it plays right into the question you were just asking, and then I'll turn it to you. It would be early decision. So early decision was always a tool for those students who really knew where they wanted to go and they just wanted to be done. And what it did, starting in about 2008, during the Great Recession, colleges started to say, oh my God, Great Recession hit in the fall. We're not quite sure we're going to be able to fill a class, although they would have, but let's try to lock in as many students as we can. And so that year, in that one particular year, and I point this out in the book, they might have accepted maybe before that, maybe 20, 25% of their class early. That one year, they went up to almost 50. So almost half the class was coming in early because they wanted to lock them in because they had no idea what the spring was going to be like. And then after that, they never went back down. And so suddenly now students and parents got really savvy to this. And they said, oh, to get into these places, we have to apply early. So what happened? More kids started applying early. And then they started to look at the statistics. And so it was so interesting. The year I was inside this process, interviewing students at these, highly selective high schools, private and public, really just good high schools. And in October, they would say, well, I'm applying somewhere early. I just don't know where. And that to me showed how the whole process of early decision changed from something like where I really wanted to go to something that I was trying to game the system to try to figure out where to get in. And I don't blame them, but it was colleges that really prepped them for that. So if I were to change anything and wave that magic wand, I'd get rid of early decision. Never going to happen, but that's what I would do. How about you? What would you do?
I'll also do a magic wand that's never going to happen. Well, maybe it could. I think that freshman class sizes need to be enlarged. I think that especially at universities with these enormous endowments like Harvard and Stanford, like $30 billion they're sitting on, use that to make the classes bigger. And then you're able to fulfill all of these great things they're trying to do, like, admit a more diverse class, change up the demographics a bit. But okay, if you still need the kids who can pay full freight to help offset costs, let them in too. I just think there need to get rid of what you say, to get rid of this scarcity issue. There needs to be more slots, and I don't see why not. Anyway, that would be my wish.
So Nicole, how what should universities do? So let's move on to some of the questions here because we're getting some good ones. So what should universities do to prevent this from happening in the future? Somebody asked about, blind admissions, not even seeing anything about what the parents do and who the children are. Now that you've been kind of through and inside how this happened, and I'm kind of curious in your reporting, did these colleges really kind of change their process after this, or did they kind of put a few things in place and that was the end of it? So I'm kind of interested in that. Like, did colleges really change? And more so from a system level, how might you prevent this from happening?
The changes I saw put in place were most specifically to do with athletics. So that's because that's where most of the holes that Rick Singer was exploiting were. So at a lot of schools, especially the ones that were involved in this, there are now checks and balances. There's more fact checking about, before it was just like a coach would sort of have this athletic profile and the admissions people no one was fact checking it. No one was trying to see or making any attempt to confirm that kid was actually an athlete. They just trusted the coach. So that trust-based system is now gone in many of these colleges. So I think on that level, on the AD level, there have been a lot of changes, but I think the bigger systemic problem that we're talking about, no, I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
And do you think that maybe like not allowing people to see who people are in the admissions process, that I'm not quite sure how that really would have prevented Rick Singer, because, for example, he was having somebody take tests for people, right? So that wouldn't have really helped necessarily, right?
Yeah, well, actually, there's someone on Zoom, on the call here, who I had a parent who I had this conversation with recently, and we were talking about this, and this is her idea, not mine. But you could almost do like Zoom interviews with the students, or some way, and maybe there aren't enough people in the admissions office to handle all of that because there's tens of thousands of applicants and only like a dozen of these admissions officers. But maybe you could outsource that to trusted counselors or trusted people in the community, just like the universities hire readers to kind of do that first pass and reading essays and that kind of thing. But somehow, some way for the universities to actually see the student and interact with them for any amount of time, just to see, is this kid serious? Does this kid seem like, the type of kid that would thrive here? Or does this just seem like some kid that's being slipped through the side door?
Yeah, and it's interesting, some selective colleges do alumni interviews, and people always ask me, do they matter? And most of the time they don't. In fact, I saw this at Emory. They would open it up if they saw there was an alumni interview. They really are doing that for the alums to make them feel pretty good about being part of the process in some way. So there's a question that I wanted to take on, because it was a couple of people have upvoted it here. How in terms of when to submit SAT scores to test optional colleges. In other words, are they telling us the truth by being test optional? It's an interesting question. This is a question I got a lot last fall when my book first came out, because test optional was so new to so many people. Although before the pandemic, more than 1,000 colleges were test optional. There were just few of the very selective that were. The University of Chicago is the most selective, but most of them were the small liberal arts in New England, and then a bunch of less selective schools. And then during the pandemic, 600 plus more selective colleges went test optional. And so I think a lot of parents were suspicious last year. So here's what I will say now that we're kind of almost through the entire admissions process for this first pandemic class. And that's this. When I talk to admissions deans at most of the selective colleges, they will tell me that their applications without test scores, test optional applications, are running anywhere between 25 and 50% of applications. 50%, that's a lot. Even 25% is a decent amount. And they're not through acceptances yet, but they are mostly running around the same. So 25% of the class apply, or the applicant pool is test optional, and maybe 25% of acceptances are test optional. So what I think this is saying to me is, yes, when they say test optional, they're test optional. Now, here's the problem, because I'm actually working on the paperback edition of my book now, and I'm trying to figure out how, come April, when admissions decisions are done, are colleges going to tell us, are they going to release those numbers? Because two things will happen. If they release numbers that show their test optional numbers were really high, in other words, they accepted a lot of students test optional and they had a lot of applicants test optional, what they're going to see next year is a huge rise in applications. Now, they love applications, but they don't want way too many of them because they have to process all of them. And on the other side, if they were they didn't accept a lot of students test optional, maybe they had a lot of applicants test optional, but they didn't accept it, then people are going to go back to this question, the person asking this question, like, well, you're not really test optional. You're telling us you are, and you're not. And so I think there's actually an incentive in so many ways for them not to release that number this year. So we may not quite know whether these, a lot of details from these institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean the whole SAT, this whole test optional thing sent admissions kind of into, I don't know. It was a little crazy this year, no, with COVID
It
and
was, and it
test
kind of
optional
threw.
and
I loved that chapter in your book. What was it? Getting a score. I can't remember what you called it.
nailing a score, I think.
Nailing a score, right? And this person who essentially flew all over the country to take the test for, or not take the test for students. They would fill out a fake grid essentially, right? And then
Yeah.
he would copy it over afterwards to fill in the right things. And what I think that showed is what is so true about the SAT is that this person, his name was Mark, right?
Mark Riddell. Yeah.
Mark Riddell. He was a good test taker.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, out of a job now with test optional.
Yeah, he's out of a job, right? But that's the thing about the SAT and the ACT is that they're not really, they don't necessarily test what's in high school all the time. And in fact, one of the interesting things that Rick Clark, who's the director of admissions at Georgia Tech, so great STEM school, right? He said that 93% of their test optional kids this year have taken calculus or above in high school. And the thing about the SAT is that it really doesn't test a lot of calculus. Yes, you can answer the questions a lot faster and better if you've had calculus. But what he's saying is that the test, even having a test score, doesn't give us a much better signal than the high school transcript does, because we have so many kids coming with such high, these are high achieving students coming with such great high school records. It's not giving us anything more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at some of the other questions here. So we kind of answered the question about whether this will change the system when limiting the number of schools an incoming freshman could apply to could be a solution. It could potentially be a solution, I think, in terms of that. So I guess, Nicole, one of the things I wanted to ask you around the whole book was, because this topic was in the news so much, what surprised you in reporting the book? Like, what thing did you feel like, wow, I didn't really realize that in all the news coverage immediately after the scandal broke?
I mean, I think it's kind of it's a lot of what we're talking about. I was really surprised at the frustration, or just at what college admissions had become, because I mean, you're someone who covers this and have been for a very long time, but this was new to me in a lot of ways. And so, my last memory was applying to college, and there were some similarities. I mean, it was considered, I don't know, I found it kind of hard to get into college, but I didn't sail in. And I was obsessed with, I got to take the Princeton review. That was all you could do back then. I was like, and I thought that was amazing. I was like, oh my God, I'm really gaming this system. But just how much it had changed. And yeah, the expansion of this whole independent counselor field, and the feeling that these parents that all the rules were being rewritten, that it used to be, send your kid here, do this, do that, and you have a pretty good chance of winding up where you want to go, that all of it was being rewritten. Yeah. I guess that's what I'd say. So one thing, go on.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. I know we're running out of time here. So go ahead.
One other thing about, we're talking about getting rid of the SAT. I mean, how hard do you think this will be for colleges? Because even though a lot of them, or most of them, are preaching holistic admissions and it's not about the SAT score. I mean, especially for these big public schools, I mean, those SATs are still very valuable in like slimming down the numbers, at least for a first pass, to kind of be like, who's in the ballpark here and who's not. So I just wonder, A, how hard is this going to be for colleges to lose that very convenient number to look at? And B, I mean, will something replace it that's equally, unambiguous, I guess?
I kind of laugh because I'm not quite sure what can replace it that is not just as controversial, right? I think it just comes down to a test being so controversial. I think, yes, especially I think that there will be pressure on colleges and universities to bring the test back once this is over by faculty in some places. Faculty really control the process. This was the case at the University of California, which changed its mind like 3 times this past year around testing, right? The faculty report actually supported testing. Originally, the faculty report that went to the regions, and then it was changed, and then the regions kind of moved in a different direction. And then, of course, there was a lawsuit that really changed a lot of stuff in the UC system. And I think that's going to happen in other places as well. I think the faculty will want to go back to testing because they believe that there are, these standards that have to be upheld, and it's only the tests that can do that. I think there's going to be political pressure outside of the faculty, including among lawmakers in the state who again believe that there is some sort of standards with the test. And I think among the privates, alums who will say, wait a second, I think it's very similar to the debate now around student loan forgiveness, right? Well, I paid it, so why should people get forgiveness? It's the same thing with the test. Well, I took it and I had to go through that to get into Harvard or Georgetown or wherever. So I'm going to, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure just culturally to bring back the test. I would imagine we're going to probably see about half these schools do it. Now, I think the other half will say, they won't feel that pressure and will probably go test optional because in some ways it's just easier to get more. They get more applications that way and things like that. So I think there will be pressure to for some of these other schools to go back, but not everyone.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
So I think we're running out here. How is it possible? Okay, I'll answer this NYU question, and then I'll ask the NYU question, and then Nicole, I'll kind of let you have the last word about anything that we didn't talk about tonight. So I mentioned readers for essays. Who are they? How did the ratings feel into the overall? How is it possible that they could read 100,000 applications? So they actually do. But remember, they're giving most of these applications 2 to 5 minutes. In most of the cases that I saw, maybe 10 minutes was a lot. Remember, a lot of this is organized in a way they don't actually see the real application. It comes in electronically to them. Somebody's recalculating the GPA. They're seeing the transcript. Most of these selective colleges now have something called committee-based evaluation, where they have 2 readers at the same time. They split the application in half. And for the essay in particular, and even the recommendations, they're really speed reading those, right? So they will have one person will be reading those while the other person's looking at the transcript, and they'll summarize it as they're going. And for most of the essays, they're mind-numbingly similar. That's one place, by the way, I think students really could really could focus on and focus less on trying to write an essay that they think the other person on the side of the desk wants to read, and more that just gives them a sense of who they are, much more authentic. Most of these essays are not really that authentic. They read something in an essay book about what they should write about, or some essay coach or independent counselor tells them what they should write about, and that ends up being the essay, and it's just not really authentic from an 18-year-old perspective. So Nicole, I will again. I just finished Nicole's book last week. Loved it. It's a page turner. And so Nicole, anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we point out before we leave tonight? I have your
book right here. There's a book, and it is behind you, so we got it.
Yes, it is behind me.
I think I'll end by asking you something. I'm tied into something someone's saying here. They said, but these solutions that you're proposing aren't getting at the problem, which is the obsession with attending one school instead of another. So one conversation I had a lot, or that constantly came up, and it'll be no surprise to you, about what's feeding the obsession is the rankings, the U.S. News World Report, which you mentioned, and you were there. I mean, you were kind of inside that as well. I mean, would that help if we stopped ranking these schools?
It would.
We looked at that number,
but we're not. Magazine. You're in the magazine business too, right? These rankings make money for the. In fact, U.S. News doesn't even exist as a magazine anymore, but it's still making money on the rankings. And colleges have tried to stop participating in them. It never quite worked. I always tell students and parents when they're looking at it's not that the rankings are terrible, but look at what the rankings are ranking, what they're measuring. Nobody ever looks at the methodology of the U.S. News and World Report rankings. 20% of the methodology, 20% of the final ranking is based on a survey of college presidents. If you as a parent think, well, this is what another college president thinks of this school, if you think that's important, then put a lot of stock into the U.S. News and World Report rankings. It's also about what percentage of faculty have PhDs, right? What percentage of classes are under 20 students? some classes are good to have under 20 students. But as I point out in the book, this is how Northeastern try to game the rankings. They try to make all of their classes under 20 just to look better in that piece of the rankings. So I think that's really critically important. So any other final thoughts from you before we sign off?
No, I think you need to read both our books to see the frustration on one hand and the solution on the other, and to feel that there's hope with Jeff's book. So well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Jeff. That was such an insightful talk. And thank you to everyone who submitted such thoughtful questions and participated in the chat. Just glancing at the discussion we've had in the chat, it's been fascinating. So thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight. Again, to support Vroman's Bookstore, please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured books. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and it'll take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. And also, a replay of this talk will be available after the broadcast ends. So if you tuned in late or you have a friend who was unable to make it tonight, just send them the link to the stream and they can rewatch it. And I think that about covers it. Thank you, everyone, again, and stay safe, everyone. And have a good night.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Jeff, for being an amazing.
And thank you, Nicole.
Running the show.
Buy the books.
Yeah, buy the books. Bye.